Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Big Time Adulting. Today, I have one of my favorite people on Instagram and somebody who I just have followed closely for a while in terms of her breadth of knowledge and helpful information, Emily Oster, renowned economist and big time IG economist. Like your
I
your
think I might be
Instagram.
like the biggest Instagram economist.
Yeah, it's fucking
Yeah.
great because you're putting out such awesome material, especially for our demographic of moms. I remember when I first was introduced to your work, which was in 2013 when I was pregnant with my oldest, and I came across an article written by you because I was probably in a Google rabbit hole, and I think it popped up, and it was called Thinking About Pregnancy Like an Economist. And
Mhm.
it was like everything I ever wanted to hear as a pregnant woman. Like it just made me feel so much better about the fears that I had had. Like, and particularly this article was like, there is no hard and fast evidence that any low amount of alcohol will damage you or your baby rather
Yeah.
while you're pregnant. And I was like, fuck yes. I can't wait to have my glass of wine this weekend and not feel scared about it or whatever. Cause I think I knew like in my heart, like, this
Yeah.
is crazy. Like,
And
how
and
could,
like for a lot of women, your OB will tell you that, right? Like, oh, don't have too much, have one, it's okay. But then it's like, well, why? I want to know the data.
yeah. And so did that just, when you became pregnant, when you became a mom, were you like, all right, what's the real deal here?
Yeah, I got pregnant and I mean, I found pregnancy, this aspect of being told what to do in pregnancy, really jarring, like
Mm.
really an unusual experience because up until that point, mostly I had told myself what to do. Or if I was getting advice from someone, it would be couched in like, here is why. And there was so much of this stuff in pregnancy that was just, here's what to do. Here's a list of foods not to eat with no description of like, what would happen if you ate those? Like, would your baby have horns? Like if I have an oyster, like what could happen? Like I just didn't even like understand, is that the same as eating turkey? And so much
Yeah.
of the early stuff was just, I want to understand this. I want to understand this better. And then, I come from a particular angle. I'm an economist. I work with data. That's my love language, is my area of expertise. And so that was my natural way, and was like, okay, surely there's evidence and data on these questions and I can dig into it.
Who knew that you could make data fun?
Who knew? I did know, because I have always thought data was fun, but it's only recently that I've pulled other people into that
Yeah. Well,
experience.
it's honestly amazing because like moms are latching on hard and fast to your information and the data and everything that you put out there because I think it makes us all feel a lot better, especially the way that you present it, because what you do so well is you discuss nuances and how important that is when interpreting rules and that kind of thing and evidence or whatever it is. I want you kind of to describe in your own words, like what it is that you do and your goals, like when you're researching.
So I think, so first of all, there's like, what do I do in my academic life? Which is like, I write papers like with titles like unobservable selection and coefficient stability theory and evidence. So that's fun. But what I do in my broader work, I would describe as translation. So what I really care about doing is saying there is a body of evidence, of research, of science that should inform our decisions. And one very substantial barrier is that that information is not typically conveyed in a way that people can understand, because it's jargony, it's
Totally.
requires a lot of background. And so what I am trying to do is simplify that, and not simplify like, I read the paper and let me tell you what it is, but simplify it like, let me explain to you what you would get out of this paper. And let me explain to you with non-jargony words why some evidence is better than other evidence. And I think that's really my goal, is to help people be a little more data literate. So when they see some of these things like panic headlines, like if your kid watches any screens, they'll turn into a, bottom dwelling slug, you can be like, well, that doesn't really sound right. Like maybe I should look into that a little more.
Yeah, I hadn't even planned to ask you about this, but like just in terms of not just parenting stuff, but media in general and headlines in general, and the way they kind of propel us into a state of panic and kind of take us away from the facts of things sometimes and reality. Yeah. And I have health anxiety like a mother. So like, I feel like whatever the things that you say I find to be very helpful. Like,
I mean, I think part of the issue is that the media, like, you think about what are the incentives? Like, the media's incentive is for you to read. And a headline that's like, there's a small correlation, which might mean nothing between these variables. Like, you're not clicking on that, but when the headline says, like, screens, like, or the headline says, like, eating red meat, kills you immediately, you're like, oh, I'm going to find out more about that. I definitely would want to know if that were true. And so the incentives, particularly in headlines and even in coverage, I think are towards this sort of like panic approach.
Yeah.
Which is not good.
Yeah. And I feel like you're working to quell that panic. And
Yes.
So you do like a weekly Q&A on your Instagram, which is awesome, but it's also seriously remarkable because you are able to just pull statistics right out of your ass. I don't know how do you have an encyclopedic brain? Do you have to like go back and look these? But it seems like you're firing out these answers. Like it's honestly incredible.
It varies. There are many questions that people ask that I do know the answer to, because I have written about them before. And sometimes I will look up to get like some number or something that I've forgotten. And sometimes people will ask something and I'll be like, I don't know the answer to this. And in some ways, like those are the most fun, where it's like specific and it feels like, oh, there probably is an answer here, but I don't know what it is. And so sometimes those, then I will like rabbit hole a little bit and try to like figure out the answer quickly. But I don't know.
If there are like questions that come your way that actually have nothing to do with data, like I'm scared about something, do you
answer those?
Yeah.
I think that it is very important for these. I have found with these Q&As, they're like, I'm doing a lot of questions in a given day. It is good to have a balance. Like sometimes people want to see something funny. Like I just did a thing where, there were a bunch of ones in the row and like one of them, I don't know, some of them were about data, but then I have this thing on my arm, you can see. And somebody was like, what's on your arm? And so then I got to explain like, I mean, that's not a data question, but then you get like a little break from the data to find out that I had a chafing problem with my running lights.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah. There's like, and this, I've like wrapped it in this tourniquet situation.
Like the olden days.
Like the olden days. Yeah. It's fine. It's just, if you're ever like really bad chafing when you exercise, it's like, it's horrible.
They have Body Glide and stuff like that.
I know they have. I know, and I have it, but I just didn't realize that the things were going to chafe this particular arm anyway.
My armpits chafe a lot.
I chafe under my bra. That's like my biggest issue.
Same there too. Sometimes to the point of bleeding.
Bleeding, I know. Mine got so bad that one time I showed my son and he was horrified, and he made me this bracelet with like that like spells out bras are butts, and so now I can wear that to feel better.
We can edit this part out.
I don't know. People need to know this information.
Leave it in. Okay. No, that's what you are out. I was going to say you're an avid runner.
Yes.
And like, are you, where do you qualify yourself as a runner? Like you distance, mid-distance, slow?
I am training for my first marathon.
Exciting. Which marathon?
CIM.
When's that?
In California, in the first week of December.
Okay. How's it going?
It's a lot of running. You have to run a lot of miles. I think it's going okay. Like it's a lot of running.
Yeah. Good for you.
Yeah. But yeah, it's going.
Is that kind of like your therapy, running?
It's like my self-care. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like my place to set boundaries and be like, you know what? I'm not going to be home for this like 4 hours because I'm
running a lot of miles.
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you say your kids would describe you from, like an insider bird's eye view of Emily Oster?
I'm 100% sure what they would say is that I freak out a lot, which I think is an overstatement. But I mean, I think that they, I think my kids like me. I think they like me, and I'm sort of like the primary parent, and so we spend a lot of time together. But I think they would also say that I can get like a little crazy.
Yeah, I think my kids would say the exact same thing about me. Your husband's also an economist.
He is. He's also an economist.
What kind of data does he analyze?
A lot of his work is about the media. So his early work is about the media, and so trying to understand like bias in the media. And then at the moment, he works on a lot of super technical econometrics, and he writes papers with titles like I can barely read his papers.
We're not going to understand them. The lights in this office.
None of us are going to understand them, including me. So he's very technical.
And do you guys have similar parenting style?
I think we have worked together to have a parenting style that jointly works well. I don't think our instincts are always similar, although I think they're not always exactly the same. I think they're generally similar, but we've been together since I was 20.
Nice.
And so it had been we had a long time of like working out how you do stuff together before we had to do this part together, which doesn't say it wasn't hard. But I think it works. I think it works good.
Yeah, I know. That's one of the things. I think I feel the same way. My husband and I we're two different people, like really different people, but like similar foundations, right? So like at the end, like you know that your goals are the same. That's nice.
And I think that, for me, I think that that's the part of sort of alignment with your partner that's the most important, is to be able to say, are we trying to get to the same place? Do we have the same like things that are important to us? Like there are ways in which we're almost exactly the same, which we have exactly the same taste for like what would we do on the weekend, which is like spend a lot of time as a family and not do a lot of activities. And so that ends up like, if we've had conflict about that, I think we'd fight about it all the time. As it is, it works out good.
How do you manage that, by the way, with staying away from too many activities with
we say no.
2 kids? Yeah.
Do your
kids play sports and
no. So my daughter runs cross country at school.
Yeah.
And my son does some kind of dance class or something, but we are like, I think in part I'm quite lucky because my kids haven't shown much affinity or taste for sports. And my daughter's a pretty serious violinist, and so we do a fair amount of violin, but it turns out that's actually much easier than sports because it's mostly not a team activity. So like mostly you do it in the house.
Yeah.
So, but I think it is. People ask me this a lot. Like I spend a lot of time telling people you probably are doing too many extracurriculars, like if they're interfering with your kid's sleep, or, most of the evidence does not suggest that you need to be investing in extracurriculars to the point that many American families are. But like, this is the way society is in a lot of places end up being organized. So to say like, I want to hold a day every weekend where there won't be anything planned, that's tough.
It's really hard. Yeah. We are a sporty-ish family. Some of us are more sporty than others, but
I saw a video of your husband like jumping up on boxes.
Yeah, he
seemed very sporty.
He's very athletic. Like he's like he can like run and jump type guy, would be like a track type, but wasn't. He played football. But I feel like I'm getting off topic here, but from a statistical standpoint, I think it's like 2% of kids who play sports will ever play anything in college. So it's a colossal waste of time and money if that's sort of your goal.
If that's your goal, right? And I think if you look at the data and you ask the question of the data, is there a benefit to extracurriculars? The answer is yes. There's like a socio-emotional benefit on average for many kids in having an activity like outside of school that they're good at, that they like, because it's a way to develop a sense of belonging. If your kid loves the soccer team and he loves his friends on the soccer team and maybe they're different from his school friends, then, when things are hard at school, or this is a place to feel like, I'm good at something. I'm like this is my thing. And that's really, really valuable for kids. So thinking about that as the benefit, that is a benefit.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't need to be on 7 soccer teams or trying to get to the best soccer team or, doing it all the time to get those benefits. And I think just reframing a little bit, why are we doing this, might help some people think about where are the limits that I want to be putting. And the other thing is, I just cannot emphasize enough how important sleep is and how little we prioritize sleep for our kids, especially as they get older. And if there are things that are interfering with sleep, it is worth asking. Maybe it would be better to not do those things.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of waking a child out of sleep to go to an activity pains me.
And also the idea that if you said well, my kid's doing this activity from 6 to 9 every night, and they're getting home and then they have an hour of homework. And so their 7th graders going to bed at 11 o'clock at night. That's too late. They need more sleep than that. And that's just the reality. And there's no, you can't make more hours in the day. You have to choose.
Yeah, totally. It's definitely something that I am really conscious of right now. I feel like we overcommitted this fall, and it's a great lesson for me for next year. And this is like a weed out of activities year. It's something that, like I said, I would not do. And I feel kind of like I went against my word on it. And I'm going to change things for next year 100%. Like, you have to prioritize one thing.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying about this follow-up and next year we'll do it differently. I mean, this is something I talk about a lot in the family firm, the idea of rather than saying we made a mistake or I did a bad whatever, just to be okay, we tried something, and next year we're going to follow up and we're going to use this information to make maybe a different choice.
Yeah.
To do less.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your thoughts on discipline and handling? I mean, I thought you did mention that your kids would say that you freak out sometimes. So relieved, because I freak out pretty much every day. But then I think I make up for it in other ways. But where do you land on I guess let's go right into it, gentle, scripted parenting, how that plays out in real life and long-term outcomes, all of that jazz.
So there's a couple of things that we know out of the data. So let's just start with the 2 things that I think we can agree are true in the data. So one is that there is a lot of evidence to suggest that hitting your kid as a form of punishment, whether it's spanking or some other form of corporal punishment, is not supported in the data, does not improve outcomes. A second thing to say is that any approach requires consistency. So the thing that kind of classifies all successful approaches to discipline is that they are consistent.
So if you're beating your children, just keep beating them.
No. No.
That was a distasteful joke. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
And so consistency here means, if you're going to have an approach that involves, counting and a timeout, which would be a common, 1 warning, 2 warning, 3 warning, you have a timeout, which is sort of something like triple P positive parenting or 1, 2, 3 magic, any of those kind of approaches. The main thing they emphasize is just do the same thing every time. If you tell your kid it's 1, 2, 3 timeout, every time it's 1, 2, 3 timeout. And that all of those things are delivered in a way that's not mad. It's not that you're yelling 1, 2, 3. It's just there's a system. At the end of the system, you get the consequence, and the consequence is the same every time, and kids understand what it is. That's what you want to be doing, right? So that piece of consistency is really important. Within that, there's a lot of different ways to be consistent. I think part of what happens is some of those systems are easier to do than others. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these systems that rely on some kind of warning, and then whether you call it a timeout or a break, or that those systems are successful at changing family dynamics, and that parents report being happier afterwards and kids are better behaved, whatever. I think part of the reason those work is that they're relatively easy to implement. I mean, not that they're easy to implement, but if you explain to someone how to do it, you can teach people in classes. They use these in schools. They're easy to do. it kind of works. There's no strong evidence that gentle parenting is better or less good. For some people, this is really appealing. I think the place that it can run into issues is that it's hard to implement. That some of the sort of, sometimes you just need to leave the house with your shoes on. And it can, I think people sort of run into the question of like, how do I implement consistently this system, but also sometimes leave the house with my shoes on? And it's not that you can't. I just think it requires a fair amount of work to like figure out how you're going to make that happen. I don't know. Is that?
No, I think that's a great answer. Like there are ways, but then I didn't use 1, 2, I think 1, 2, 3 magic is you get to time out after 3 or something like that. Yeah. I used 1, 2, 3 magic in a different way where I was like, I'm going to count to 3 and you can go put your shoes on, or I'm going to put them on for you.
Yeah.
And that worked well because I was like, I'm not going to use a timeout because I can't follow through on a timeout with all of this. Like we have to leave. I can't put you in timeout type thing. So I just made it about like, I'll give you to the count of 3 and you can do it, or I'll do it for you pretty much in all scenarios. Like if you don't walk over here, I will come get you and physically carry you over here type thing. And just following through with it all the time. And it really worked. Like they chose their own autonomous like way of doing things rather than me doing it for them, which was great in more than one ways. But now there are times where my kids are 8 and 10 years old and I'm not going to put their fucking shoes on for them anymore if they don't do it on the count of 3, you know? So that's no longer a legitimate threat. So raising my voice actually works. Like that's what tends to get the response that makes them actually listen and do it almost daily.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in some ways these things get much harder. These kind of questions about discipline get much harder as our kids get older, because exactly what you described, like you basically came up with what is a modified version of many of these things where the end consequence was not a timeout, but was this other thing. And like, there are so many ways to implement that when your kids are little. As we think about bigger kids, I mean, as you say, like you can't, any kind of, I'm going to pick you up and move you over here. Well, like, no, now my daughter's almost as tall as I am. Like I'm picking her up and moving her over. And so it's kind of like, I think there are still versions of this that maybe don't involve yelling, although it's just hard. It's just hard.
Yeah. And like the more action you have going on in a situation makes it the less realistic where you're able to like implement a system that works every time, I think.
I will say the advantage of older kids is that they can understand more distant punishments. So with a little kid, the sort of I'm going to do this thing as a consequence immediately is much better than like you lose 10 minutes of television like at a distant point. But for older kids, there are sort of versions of this that one can experiment with that involve consequences, you know, later that day, in a week, whatever it is. Of course, you have to be willing to follow through on those consequences too.
Yeah, I find myself in a place where like I don't really have the energy for actual punishment. Like I just want to be on like an eye-to-eye level with you, kid, where you're like, I'm asking you to do something, it's for a reason, and I expect you to listen to me, you know, like, so if that sometimes requires like a sit down conversation every now and again to remind them that they need to fucking listen.
Yeah, that's good. And then they're old enough to understand they need to, especially 10, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I think that that's one of the things that I think about so much in like the message. So I would say in so many ways where my content is completely non-scientific, that I feel like what I'm getting at often is a lot of what you put out there, which is like, you have to do what works for you. And, you know, maybe like the exact science or data isn't representative of something that works for your life. Would you say that that's like your mantra?
Absolutely. sometimes, and I think, yes, I completely agree. And I think people will often be like, what's one thing that, the data says you must do? I was like, the data is not bossy. Like when you are thinking about this, data is an input to which you add your preferences and your constraints. And the data is almost never going to be like, this is the only good choice and only a loser would do something else. It's almost always going to be like, there are benefits, there are costs and benefits to different approaches, and you need to figure out what works for you, just in almost every situation.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way that you lay it out there. You're like, these are the facts. However, if you give really like tangible examples of, like if you were talking about daycare recently on your page, and just about there are different outcomes, if there are different outcomes of children who go to daycare versus are with a parent inside the home. And go ahead, say what that piece was about.
I'll say sort of two things. So first, daycare gets this. This was in part in response to these like very scary like TikTok things where somebody was like, when you drop your infant at daycare, they think you died. Like, first of all, how would you even know if that were true? But like, okay, putting that aside, when you look at the data on daycare, there are maybe some small positive cognitive effects, maybe some small behavioral effects. Everything is small. And so ultimately that decision should really rest on like what works for your family and what is the care situation that like works for you, works for your kids, works for your budget, works for your schedule, and not because like daycare is the perfect solution for every person or not the perfect solution for every person. And I'll give you another example in that context that I've been thinking about a lot. So somebody wrote into me and said, I drop my kid off at daycare and she cries every day. And then the letter went on to say basically, and it takes me, the parent, an hour to stop crying and get over this. And like, everyone tells me daycare is important for my kid, but like all I do all day is like think about how terrible this is and cry about it. And then when I pick her up, I'm sad. And like, basically this is ruining my life. And like, I just wrote back. I was like, a lot of kids drop off to daycare. That doesn't mean that daycare is a problem. That's like sort of totally developmentally normal. But look at your email. Like you are crying every day, dropping your kid off. This isn't working for you. And like, it doesn't matter. Like daycare could be amazing for your kid's cognitive development. It's ruining your life. Like this isn't for you. And that's a case where it really, I think the preferences of this person, the feelings that she was having were so much more important than anything that would show up in the daycare about, is your kid getting a little more letters or colors or whatever. And I think just recognizing those pieces is so important for decision making.
Yeah, I love that about you. I love that about your content. And I think it's all just super helpful in interpreting the facts and then being very realistic about life as it meshes in with that. Yeah. Do you have like would that be like your mantra in terms of what you would want people to know about?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I want people to know, I think if I had to like have a sentence, maybe it's like, there's no right way to do it. There's only what's right for you.
Yeah.
And that's it. Gotta find what's right for you.
That's actually the answer that I give every time people ask me that question too. It's the exact same answer, and I have no fucking credibility. So
I disagree. I listen and I think that you have a lot of credibility.
I really appreciate that. Before I let you go, what's your favorite snack? Is this the hardest question so far?
Oh my God, this is the hardest question. I love snacks. So I have these like, I eat so many snacks. There's these like blender muffins with like oats and like, it's like banana and oats. I don't know, this like.
You make the muffin.
Yeah, you make the muffin, but they're really easy because you just put all the stuff in a blender. And also my family doesn't like them. So that's a win because then no one else eats them.
They're your snack.
They're mine. They're my snack.
Is there a protein element to them, or are they just a straight up
Greek, like no, it's like Greek yogurt and some eggs. So it's like
nice,
it's sort of like a baked oatmeal in a muffin form.
Did you find this recipe on social media?
So there's a woman who I both follow and work with named Megan Featherston, who is like a endurance sports dietitian person, and this is her recipe.
Awesome. I'll have to check her out.
Oh, she's great. She's like totally into how you should like eat a lot of carbohydrates, and she's great for like sports fueling.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, everyone needs to come visit you on Instagram.
Prof. Emily Oster.
Prof. Emily Oster, because you are a professor at Brown University.
Yeah.
Ivy League school.
Here I am in my office.
There you are. Even though you're on sabbatical.
Yeah.
Until
my office is in like for the whole calendar year, but my office is in the like top back corner of some like house building, and no one else ever comes in. So I have it's very nice. It's
perfect. No small talk.
No small talk. No. There are a few graduate students, but I close. I'm still on sabbatical, so don't look at me.
I'm not here right now.
I'm not here. This is an illusion. I'm wearing sporting clothes, so you can't speak with me.
And your podcast is parenting data.
It's parent data. It's
parent data.
So the newsletter is called Parent Data. The website's called parentdata.org. Podcast called Parent Data.
I love how just like simple it is. It's like, here you go. Here's your fucking parent data.
I came up with the name Parent Data for my newsletter in February of 2020 when I was going to write this newsletter like twice a month. And then there was COVID and I did so much and like the whole thing like turned into a whole thing. But I'm glad that I chose Parent Data because I like it. But I chose it with no thought at all. I was just like, I guess this is what I'll call my newsletter.
And now you're like
2,000 people.
The number one parenting news.
Well, there you go.
Well, you're awesome. And I really appreciate you coming today. And I hope we can do something in the future, maybe some kind of a collaboration between science and humor.
That would be amazing.
I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.